Number 1. Jaycee Dugard, 18 years in captivity. Jaycee Lee Dugard was just 11 years old when she was snatched from a quiet street in South Lake Tahoe, California, on the morning of June 10, 1991, while walking to a school bus stop only a short distance from her home. She was grabbed in broad daylight by a man named Philip Garrido, who used a stun gun to subdue her before pulling her into a vehicle driven by his wife, Nancy Garrido. Jaycee vanished so completely and so suddenly that investigators initially had very few leads, and despite the desperate efforts of her family and law enforcement, she remained missing for nearly 2 decades while the world outside continued on without her. Philip Garrido was not an unknown figure to law enforcement at the time of the abduction. He had previously been convicted of kidnapping and rape in 1976, when he abducted a woman named Katie Hall and held her captive in a storage unit in Reno, Nevada, for several hours before he was apprehended. Despite being sentenced to 50 years in federal prison for that crime, Garrido was paroled after only 11 years, a decision that would later be scrutinized as one of the most consequential failures in the American parole system. When he took Jaycee, he was already a registered sex offender living in Antioch, California, and his parole officer had visited his home on multiple occasions over the years without ever discovering the hidden compound in the backyard where Jaycee was being held. After her abduction, Jaycee was taken to Garrido's property in Antioch and confined to a shed in the backyard, which was hidden behind tall wooden fences, tarps, and overgrown shrubbery designed specifically to conceal the makeshift compound he had constructed. She was held in isolation, subjected to repeated sexual assault, and completely cut off from the outside world. Over the years, Garrido fathered 2 daughters with Jaycee, the first born when she was only 14 years old and the second born 2 years later. These children grew up inside the compound, knowing no other life, and were told by Garrido that he was their father but were kept from understanding the true nature of their mother's captivity. Jaycee was given the false name Alyssa and was at times allowed to help Garrido with his printing business, during which she occasionally had limited contact with the outside world, but she was so thoroughly controlled and manipulated that she never attempted to escape or call for help. Garrido had psychologically conditioned her to believe that the outside world was dangerous and that he was her protector, a classic and devastating form of trauma bonding that is well documented in cases of long-term captivity. The case broke open on August 24, 2009, when 2 University of California Berkeley police officers, Ally Jacobs and Lisa Campbell, became suspicious of Garrido when he came onto campus with 2 young girls to apply for a permit to hold a religious gathering. Officer Jacobs found something deeply unsettling about Garrido's demeanor and about the way the girls interacted with him, and she ran a background check that revealed his status as a registered sex offender. She contacted his parole officer, and the following day Garrido was called in for questioning. He initially arrived at the parole office with Nancy, Jaycee, and the 2 daughters, and it was during this meeting that Jaycee, after so many years of silence, finally identified herself as the missing girl from South Lake Tahoe. The revelation shocked investigators and sparked an immediate criminal investigation. When police searched the Garrido property in Antioch, they discovered the full extent of the hidden compound, including multiple sheds, tents, and structures where Jaycee and her daughters had been living in squalid and deeply disturbing conditions. Neighbors who were interviewed after the arrest expressed disbelief, with many saying they had occasionally heard sounds from the backyard or noticed unusual activity but had never suspected the true horror of what was happening on the other side of those fences. Philip Garrido was charged with 29 felony counts including kidnapping, rape, and false imprisonment. He pleaded guilty in April 2011 and was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy Garrido, who had actively participated in the abduction and had been aware of and complicit in Jaycee's captivity throughout the entire 18 years, also pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 36 years to life. The case prompted major reforms in California's sex offender monitoring system and parole supervision procedures, with legislators and law enforcement officials acknowledging that systemic failures at multiple levels had allowed Garrido to continue his crimes undetected for so long. Jaycee Dugard emerged from captivity with extraordinary resilience and went on to write a memoir titled A Stolen Life, published in 2011, in which she detailed her experiences with unflinching honesty. She also established the Jaycee Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting families dealing with abduction and helping survivors of trauma recover and rebuild their lives. Her daughters, who had known no life outside the compound, faced the enormous challenge of integrating into a society they had never been part of, and Jaycee has spoken publicly about the ongoing work of healing that her family continues to undertake years after their liberation. The case of Jaycee Dugard stands as both a devastating indictment of failures in the criminal justice and parole systems and as a profound testament to the capacity of the human spirit to endure and ultimately survive conditions of almost unimaginable suffering. Number 2. Elizabeth Smart, A Nation Holds Its Breath. Elizabeth Smart was 14 years old and asleep in the bedroom she shared with her younger sister Mary Catherine in their family's home in the Federal Heights neighborhood of Salt Lake City, Utah, when a man entered through a kitchen window in the early morning hours of June 5, 2002, crept through the house and took her at knife point. Her sister Mary Catherine, who was 9 years old at the time, witnessed the abduction from her bed but was too terrified to move or cry out, lying completely still as the intruder led Elizabeth out of the room and out of the house into the night. It was not until Mary Catherine was certain the man was gone that she went to her parents' room and told them what had happened, triggering a frantic call to police and the beginning of one of the most publicized missing child cases in American history. Elizabeth's father, Ed Smart, was a prominent real estate broker, and the family's profile, combined with the brazen nature of the crime, quickly attracted national media attention. Search parties were organized across the Salt Lake Valley, tips poured in from across the country, and the case was featured prominently on national news programs, including America's Most Wanted. Despite the enormous effort and publicity, Elizabeth remained missing for 9 months, during which time her family endured a nightmare of uncertainty, false leads, and public scrutiny. The man who took Elizabeth was Brian David Mitchell, a self-styled religious extremist who had briefly worked as a handyman at the Smart family home in the months before the abduction. Mitchell was a deeply disturbed individual who had constructed an elaborate delusional belief system around a self-appointed identity as a prophet figure, and he had decided that Elizabeth was to become one of his plural wives in accordance with what he claimed were divine commandments. He took Elizabeth to a camp he had established in the hills above Salt Lake City, where he lived with his wife and accomplice, Wanda Barzee, and there he subjected Elizabeth to repeated rape and physical abuse while forcing her to live under a new name and to accept his delusional religious framework as her reality. Mitchell kept Elizabeth restrained with a cable attached to a tree for the first several weeks of her captivity, ensuring she could not escape, and he used a combination of religious coercion, threats, and psychological manipulation to maintain control over her throughout the 9 months she was held. He eventually began taking her out in public, disguising her with a gray wig and a white robe and veil that were ostensibly part of his religious costume, and on several occasions Elizabeth was in the direct presence of search party members and law enforcement officers without being recognized or rescued. In one particularly haunting instance, officers who were looking for Elizabeth actually spoke to Mitchell at his camp without realizing that Elizabeth was hidden a short distance away. The breakthrough in the case came on March 12, 2003, when a couple in Sandy, Utah, recognized Mitchell and Barzee from composite sketches that had been broadcast on the television program America's Most Wanted and called police. Officers responded and found Elizabeth with the pair. When police first approached, Elizabeth denied being Elizabeth Smart, so thoroughly had Mitchell conditioned her to maintain her false identity, but she was soon identified and reunited with her family in a moment that brought an outpouring of relief and joy from a nation that had followed her case with anxious intensity. Brian David Mitchell was prosecuted federally, and his trial was a lengthy and complex proceeding complicated by questions about his mental competency, which his defense attorneys argued made him unfit to stand trial. Multiple competency hearings were held over the years following his arrest, and he was found incompetent on several occasions, leading to extended periods of mental health treatment before he was ultimately deemed competent to stand trial. In December 2010, Mitchell was convicted of kidnapping and transportation of a minor across state lines for sexual activity and was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Wanda Barzee, who had facilitated the abduction and participated in the abuse, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and was released in September 2018 after serving her sentence, a development that prompted significant public concern given that she had shown no genuine remorse and had continued to express devotion to Mitchell even after their prosecution. Elizabeth Smart responded to her release with characteristic directness, publicly stating her belief that Barzee remained dangerous. Elizabeth Smart herself became one of the most prominent and effective advocates for child safety and victims' rights in the United States following her rescue. She has written a memoir, spoken extensively about her experiences, worked as a news correspondent, and established the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, which focuses on education and prevention programs aimed at protecting children from abduction and abuse. She married in 2012 and has children of her own, and she has spoken movingly about her journey toward healing and her determination not to allow what was done to her to define the rest of her life. Number 3, Ariel Castro's Three Prisoners, a decade of horror in Cleveland. On the evening of May 6, 2013, a man named Charles Ramsey was eating a meal at his home on Seymour Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, when he heard screaming coming from the house next door. The house belonged to his neighbor, a man named Ariel Castro, a school bus driver who had lived on the street for years and was known to neighbors as a somewhat eccentric but seemingly ordinary person. Ramsey went to investigate and found a young woman screaming and trying to force open the front door, which was locked from the outside. He helped her break open the door, and the young woman, who identified herself as Amanda Berry, came out holding a small child and screaming that she needed the police called immediately. What Charles Ramsey had stumbled upon was the end of one of the most horrifying cases of long-term captivity ever discovered in the United States, a case in which 3 young women had been held as prisoners in Ariel Castro's house for periods ranging from approximately 10 to 11 years. Amanda Berry had been abducted on April 21, 2003, the day before her 17th birthday, while walking home from her job at a Burger King restaurant. Georgina DeJesus had been abducted on April 2, 2004, at the age of 14, while walking home from school. Michelle Knight had been abducted in August 2002, when she was 21 years old, while looking for a relative's home in the area. All 3 women had been lured or taken by Castro and brought to his house on Seymour Avenue, where he imprisoned them in various rooms, chained them to walls and poles, subjected them to systematic rape and brutal physical violence, and kept them completely hidden from the outside world for years. The house on Seymour Avenue was in a densely populated urban neighborhood, surrounded by other homes and regularly visited by Castro's own family members, including his adult children, none of whom discovered or suspected the presence of the captives hidden inside. Castro had constructed an elaborate system of locks, barricades, and covered windows to prevent the women from being seen or heard, and he controlled them through a regime of extreme violence, starvation, and psychological terror. Michelle Knight was subjected to particularly brutal treatment, including multiple forced miscarriages that Castro deliberately induced through starvation and physical violence when she became pregnant. Amanda Berry gave birth to a daughter fathered by Castro in December 2006, delivering the child with only Michelle Knight's assistance in a plastic paddling pool inside the house. After Amanda Berry's escape triggered the police response on May 6, 2013, officers arrived at the scene within minutes and quickly freed Georgina DeJesus and Michelle Knight from inside the house. All 3 women were taken to hospital and reunited with their families, and their survival after so many years became an immediate international news sensation. Ariel Castro was arrested the same night and faced a massive criminal indictment containing hundreds of charges including aggravated murder for the forced miscarriages, kidnapping, and rape. Castro avoided the death penalty by agreeing to plead guilty to 937 criminal counts in August 2013, and he was sentenced to life in prison plus 1,000 years without the possibility of parole. However, Castro served less than a month of his sentence before being found dead in his prison cell on September 3, 2013, in what was ruled an autoerotic asphyxiation, though some questions about the circumstances of his death have been raised over the years. The house on Seymour Avenue was demolished in August 2013 at the request of the survivors, and a memorial garden was planted in its place. Amanda Berry, Georgina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight, who later changed her name to Lily Rose Lee, all went on to write books about their experiences and have worked in various capacities as advocates for other survivors. The case raised profound and disturbing questions about how 3 women could be held captive for a decade in a residential urban neighborhood without anyone knowing, and it prompted discussions about community awareness, the failures of missing persons investigations particularly in cases involving older teenagers and young adults from lower-income backgrounds, and the long-term trauma experienced by survivors of prolonged captivity. Number 4. Trisha Meili, the Central Park jogger who refused to give up. On the night of April 19, 1989, Trisha Meili, a 28-year-old investment banker, went for a run in Central Park in New York City, a routine she had followed many times before. She never completed that run. Meili was attacked, beaten with a rock and a pipe, bound, gagged, raped, and left for dead in a ravine near the 102nd Street Transverse Road. She was not found until approximately 1.5 hours after the attack, when 2 men discovered her body lying in mud and water and called for help. By the time paramedics reached her, she had lost approximately 75% of her blood, her body temperature had dropped to 85 degrees, and she was in a deep coma with massive brain trauma, facial fractures, and internal injuries so severe that the medical professionals who treated her initially did not expect her to survive the night. The case erupted into one of the most sensational and controversial criminal investigations in New York City history, occurring at a time when the city was experiencing enormous racial tension, a crack cocaine epidemic, and a surge in violent crime that had the population living in fear. Responding to enormous pressure to solve the crime quickly, the New York City Police Department focused their investigation on a group of young Black and Latino teenagers who had been in the park that night engaging in a pattern of harassment and assault on other park visitors, a phenomenon that was described in media coverage at the time using the term wilding. 5 teenagers, Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salaam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise, who ranged in age from 14 to 16, were arrested and interrogated over many hours, and 4 of the 5 gave videotaped confessions that the police and prosecutors presented as evidence of their guilt. The 5 teenagers, who became known as the Central Park Five, were tried and convicted in 2 separate trials in 1990 and sentenced to terms ranging from 5 to 15 years in juvenile and adult correctional facilities. All 5 maintained their innocence, and advocates argued from the beginning that the confessions had been coerced from vulnerable minors who had been interrogated without adequate legal representation. Trisha Meili, meanwhile, was engaged in a battle for her life and then a battle to rebuild it. She emerged from her coma after 12 days and faced a recovery process of extraordinary difficulty and duration. She had to relearn basic functions, struggled with significant cognitive and physical challenges as a result of her injuries, and dealt with the added burden of having her case, and her identity as the Central Park jogger, become a matter of intense public debate. She had no memory of the attack itself and was therefore unable to provide any testimony about what had actually happened to her. For more than a decade, the case appeared to be closed. Then in 2002, a man named Matias Reyes, who was serving a life sentence in New York State Prison for a series of rapes and a murder committed in the late 1980s and early 1990s, came forward and confessed that he alone had attacked and raped Trisha Meili in Central Park. DNA testing confirmed that Reyes was the source of the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene, evidence that had never matched any of the 5 convicted teenagers. In December 2002, the convictions of all 5 men, who were by then adults and had long since served their sentences, were vacated. The city of New York settled a civil lawsuit brought by the exonerated men in 2014 for $41 million, and the case became one of the most cited examples of the dangers of false confessions, coercive interrogation of juveniles, and the role of racial bias in the criminal justice system. Trisha Meili went on to write a memoir, I Am the Central Park Jogger, published in 2003, in which she described her experience of recovery and her perspective on the case. She became a public speaker and advocate for brain injury survivors and crime victims, and she has spoken about the complexity of her feelings about the exoneration of the 5 men and her continued process of healing. The case of the Central Park Five and Trisha Meili remains one of the most examined and debated cases in American legal history, a case that simultaneously represents the triumph of a survivor's will to live and a devastating systemic failure of justice. Number 5, Natascha Kampusch, 8 years underground in Austria. On the morning of March 2, 1998, 10-year-old Natascha Kampusch left her family's apartment in Vienna, Austria, and began walking to school, a journey she had made many times before along the familiar streets of the Donau district. She never arrived. She was spotted by a man named Wolfgang Pricklepil, who had been watching her and waiting for an opportunity, and she was forced into his white minivan and driven to his home in the suburb of Strashofen der Nordbahn, approximately 20 kilometers from Vienna. Pricklepil had spent years preparing for the abduction of a child, constructing a secret underground cellar beneath his garage that was specifically designed to hold a captive. The cellar, which measured approximately 5 square meters, was accessible only through a concealed door that weighed approximately 150 kilograms and was secured with multiple locks that could only be operated from the outside. The room was soundproof to prevent any cries from being heard and was equipped with basic furnishings and a ventilation system, evidence of the meticulous and premeditated nature of Pricklepil's planning. Natascha was kept in this underground room for extended periods, particularly in the early years of her captivity, emerging only when Pricklepil allowed her to, which became more frequent as the years passed and he became more confident in his psychological control over her. Austrian police launched a massive search for Natascha following her disappearance, and a witness who had seen a girl matching her description being pulled into a white minivan provided a description of the vehicle that investigators took seriously. Police actually visited Pricklepil's home during the investigation and spoke to him, but he denied any knowledge of the missing girl and his property was not thoroughly searched, a failure that has been the subject of extensive criticism and official inquiry in the years since. Pricklepil isolated Natascha completely from the outside world, controlling every aspect of her existence, dictating what she ate, when she slept, what she was allowed to read or watch, and how she was permitted to behave. He subjected her to physical abuse and psychological manipulation while simultaneously presenting himself as her protector and caretaker, creating the deeply contradictory dynamic of captivity that psychologists who later worked with Natascha described as among the most extreme cases of coercive control they had encountered. As the years passed, Pricklepill began allowing Natascha out of the cellar more frequently, and eventually she was permitted to move around the house and even accompany him on trips outside the property, always under his close supervision and control. On August 23, 2006, when Natascha was 18 years old, she was helping Pricklepill with a cleaning task outdoors when his mobile phone rang and he stepped away to take the call. Seizing the moment, Natascha ran. She made it to a neighboring property, where she identified herself to a woman who called the police. Natascha Kampusch had been missing for 8 years, 166 days, and was finally free. Upon learning of her escape, Wolfgang Pricklepill threw himself in front of a train at a Vienna railway station and died. He left no note and gave no explanation, taking whatever full understanding of his motives to the grave with him. The investigation of his property revealed the full extent of the underground prison where Natascha had spent so much of her childhood and adolescence, and the Austrian authorities faced intense scrutiny over the failures that had allowed Pricklepill to continue undetected despite having been interviewed during the original investigation. Natascha Kampusch's reintegration into the world was a complex and carefully managed process, and her public presence in the years following her liberation has been characterized by a remarkable and sometimes controversial degree of independence and self-possession. She gave detailed interviews describing her experiences, has written a memoir titled 3096 Days, and has spoken thoughtfully and with considerable psychological insight about the nature of her captivity and her own complex feelings about what she endured. She has resisted attempts by others to define her experience entirely in terms of victimhood and has insisted on the right to process and speak about her own story in her own terms, a stance that has sometimes generated controversy but that also reflects an extraordinary degree of psychological autonomy in a survivor of such prolonged trauma. Number 6. Colleen Stan, the Girl in the Box. The case of Colleen Stan is one of the most psychologically complex and disturbing survival stories in the history of documented captivity, a case that challenged investigators, psychologists, and the public alike to understand how a woman could be held in voluntary captivity for years without ever being physically restrained or prevented from leaving. In May 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan accepted a ride from a couple she knew casually, Cameron and Janice Hooker, who were traveling from Red Bluff, California, to a destination further south. Colleen was hitchhiking, a common practice at the time, and the Hookers appeared to be a respectable young couple with a baby in the car. Shortly into the journey, Cameron Hooker produced a wooden box, approximately 12 by 20 inches, which he fitted over Colleen's head and locked in place, plunging her into complete darkness and sensory deprivation. This head box, which Hooker had designed and constructed himself, became the central instrument of a 7-year campaign of psychological control that would come to define what experts have since described as a textbook case of coercive control and manufactured psychological dependency. When the Hookers arrived at their home in Red Bluff, they brought Colleen inside and Cameron presented her with a document he called the slave contract, a pseudo-legal declaration that he told Colleen she was signing over her freedom and her very existence to him as her master. Through a combination of threats, including claims that a powerful organization called the company was monitoring her at all times and would kill her and her family if she disobeyed, and the gradual escalation of control and conditioning, Hooker established a psychological grip over Colleen that proved more effective than any physical restraint. In the early period of her captivity, Colleen was kept in a wooden box beneath the Hooker's waterbed for many hours each day, emerging only when Cameron allowed her to. As the years passed, the nature of her captivity evolved in ways that seem almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. She was eventually allowed to take a job in the community, to jog outdoors, and even to correspond with her family, who had no idea what was happening to her. She continued to refer to Cameron Hooker as her master and to adhere to the rules and rituals of submission he had established, all while physically capable of walking out the door and going to the police. The psychological mechanisms that kept Colleen in this state of voluntary compliance have been extensively analyzed and are understood as a particularly extreme example of the kind of trauma bonding and coercive control that can render a person psychologically incapable of exercising the freedom that they technically possess. In 1981, Cameron Hooker actually encouraged Colleen to begin a romantic relationship with a man in the community, apparently confident that his psychological hold over her was so complete that she would not reveal her situation even when outside his direct supervision. He was right, at least for a time. Colleen maintained the relationship while continuing to live under Hooker's control for several more years. The case unraveled in 1984 when Janice Hooker, motivated by religious conversion and jealousy over Cameron's relationship with Colleen, told Colleen that the company did not exist and had never existed, that it had been a fiction Cameron invented to control her. This revelation was the catalyst that finally broke the psychological hold over Colleen, and she left the Hooker household and eventually, after a period of rebuilding her own sense of reality, went to the police. Cameron Hooker was arrested in 1984 and charged with kidnapping and multiple counts of rape and other offenses. He was convicted in 1985 and sentenced to 16 years in prison, a sentence that many observers felt was inadequate given the extraordinary nature and duration of his crimes. He was released in 1993 after serving his sentence. Janice Hooker received immunity from prosecution in exchange for her testimony against her husband. Colleen Stan went on to rebuild her life with extraordinary determination, marrying, having children, and working as an advocate for other survivors of captivity and coercive control. Her case has been extensively studied in academic and clinical literature on coercive control, trauma bonding, and the psychology of captivity, and it has profoundly influenced the understanding of how psychological manipulation can be more powerful than physical restraint in holding a person captive. Number 7. Katie Stubblefield, a face transplant and a second chance. The story of Katie Stubblefield is not a story of criminal victimization but rather of a young woman's survival against the most devastating of physical odds and the extraordinary lengths of modern medicine that gave her a second chance at life, making it one of the most remarkable human survival stories of recent decades. In March 2014, 18-year-old Katie Stubblefield from Mississippi was going through a period of deep emotional turmoil following a difficult breakup and other personal struggles when she made a decision to end her life. She used a rifle, and while the attempt did not kill her, it caused catastrophic injuries to her face, destroying almost the entire facial structure below her forehead, including her nose, her mouth, much of her jaw, and the surrounding tissues. She survived because her brother and her father found her in time to call emergency services, and she was transported to a hospital where she received emergency treatment that kept her alive, though the extent of her injuries was so severe that the medical team was initially uncertain whether survival was even advisable given the quality of life she might face. Katie and her family chose to fight, and what followed was years of extraordinarily difficult and complex medical treatment as surgeons attempted to reconstruct enough of her facial structure to allow her to breathe, eat, and speak. She underwent numerous procedures over the years following her injury, living without a functional face during this period and requiring a tracheotomy to breathe and a feeding tube to eat. Throughout this process, Katie and her family connected with a team at the Cleveland Clinic that was developing expertise in facial transplantation, one of the most complex surgical procedures in modern medicine. Face transplants involve not only the technical challenge of transferring an entire facial structure from a donor to a recipient, including skin, muscle, nerves, and bone, but also the immunological challenge of preventing the recipient's body from rejecting the foreign tissue, which requires lifelong immunosuppressive medication and carries its own significant risks. In May 2017, Katie received a full face transplant at the Cleveland Clinic in a procedure that lasted approximately 31 hours and involved a team of more than 30 surgeons, nurses, and other medical professionals. The donor was a young woman named Audrey Schneider, whose family made the extraordinary decision to donate her face following her death, an act of generosity that made Katie's procedure possible. The surgery was a technical success, and in the years following the transplant, Katie has undergone extensive rehabilitation and additional procedures to optimize the function and appearance of her new face. She has spoken publicly about her experience, about the process of learning to use a new face, about her feelings toward her donor and her donor's family, and about the psychological journey of survival, recovery, and reconstruction. Her case was documented in a National Geographic feature and has been widely covered in medical and mainstream media as one of the most complex and successful full-face transplants ever performed. Katie Stubblefield's survival represents a convergence of extraordinary human resilience and extraordinary medical achievement, and she has become an advocate for both transplant donation awareness and for open conversation about mental health and the importance of seeking help during personal crises. Her case also raises profound ethical questions about the boundaries of medical intervention and the definition of identity that continue to be discussed in medical ethics circles. Number 8. Aron Ralston, 127 hours between life and death. On April 26, 2003, 27-year-old Aron Ralston, an experienced outdoorsman and mechanical engineer from Aspen, Colorado, set out alone for a day of canyoneering in the remote Blue John Canyon section of Canyonlands National Park in southeastern Utah. It was a solo expedition, and in keeping with what he later acknowledged was a careless habit, Ralston had not told anyone where he was going or when he expected to return. Approximately an hour into his descent through a narrow slot canyon, he was maneuvering past an 800-pound chockstone, a boulder wedged in the canyon walls above a drop, when the boulder shifted without warning and fell, pinning his right hand and wrist against the canyon wall with enormous and immovable force. He was stuck in a canyon so narrow that two people could not have stood side by side, in one of the most remote and infrequently visited wilderness areas in the United States, and he was entirely alone. Ralston spent the next 5 days and 7 hours trapped in the canyon, surviving on a small amount of water and food he had brought for what was meant to be a day trip, and contemplating with increasing desperation the possibility that he was going to die in that canyon without anyone ever finding him. He had a small video camera with him, and he recorded a series of messages to his family that he believed might be found after his death. He attempted repeatedly to move the boulder using his climbing equipment and to chip away at the rock with a dull multi-tool knife, but the boulder was immovable and the rock far too hard to chip. By the 5th day his water had run out, his arm had begun to decompose, and he had lost significant body weight. He began experiencing what he later described as hallucinations and visions, including a vision of a small child that he interpreted as a future son, which he cited as a motivating factor in the decision he ultimately made. On the morning of May 1, 2003, Aron Ralston amputated his own right arm below the elbow. Using the dull blade of his multi-tool, he broke the bones in his arm by levering them against the boulder and then cut through the remaining tissue and skin, a process that took approximately 1 hour and caused extraordinary pain. Free for the first time in nearly 6 days and having lost substantial blood, Ralston then had to rappel down a 65-foot drop one-handed before hiking approximately 6 miles through the desert to his truck, a journey that took several more hours in intense desert heat. He was found by a Dutch family who happened to be hiking in the area and who summoned help by helicopter. He was airlifted to a hospital in Moab, Utah, where he received emergency treatment for dehydration, blood loss, and the traumatic amputation. Ralston's survival was attributed by medical personnel to his physical fitness, his knowledge of first aid, and what one attending physician described as almost superhuman determination. He was fitted with a prosthetic arm and returned to outdoor activities including mountain climbing with remarkable speed, and within a year of his rescue he had climbed numerous mountains including peaks in Colorado's Rocky Mountains. He wrote a memoir, Between a Rock and a Hard Place, which was published in 2004 and became the basis for Danny Boyle's acclaimed 2010 film 127 Hours, starring James Franco, which brought Ralston's story to an enormous global audience. Ralston has since become one of the most recognized motivational speakers in the world, sharing his story of survival and the insights it gave him about human resilience, decision-making, and the will to live. His case also became a touchstone in discussions about wilderness safety and the importance of leaving detailed trip itineraries with trusted contacts when venturing into remote areas, lessons that Ralston himself has been among the most vocal in promoting. Number 9. Malala Yousafzai, a bullet that could not silence her. On the afternoon of October 9, 2012, 15-year-old Malala Yousafzai was riding a school bus home through the Swat district of Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province when the bus was stopped by armed men. A young Taliban gunman climbed aboard, asked which of the girls was Malala, and when the other students' fearful glances gave her away, shot her once in the head at close range. The bullet entered the left side of her forehead, traveled along the outside of her skull, ran through the length of her neck and lodged in the muscles of her shoulder. 2 other girls on the bus were also wounded in the attack. The gunman and his accomplices fled, and the bus driver immediately drove to the nearest medical facility, where Malala received emergency treatment before being transferred to a military hospital in Peshawar. Malala Yousafzai had been a target of the Pakistani Taliban, the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, for years before the attack. She had grown up in the Swat Valley, a region that had experienced significant Taliban influence and control during a period in the late 2000s when the militant group had imposed its extreme interpretation of Islamic law on the region, banning girls from attending school and enforcing restrictions on women's movement and activities. Her father, Jaycee Yousafzai, ran a school in the region and was a committed advocate for girls' education, and Malala had grown up sharing his convictions. Beginning when she was 11 years old, she had written an anonymous blog for the BBC Urdu service describing daily life under Taliban rule and advocating for the right of girls to attend school. When her identity became known, she gave interviews to journalists and appeared in a documentary, becoming an increasingly prominent and vocal advocate for girls' education not only in Pakistan but internationally. The Taliban had made explicit threats against her before the attack, and local police had warned her family, but the decision was made to continue her activism and her school attendance. The shooting of a 15-year-old girl on a school bus provoked worldwide condemnation and an outpouring of support for Malala from governments, international organizations and ordinary people around the world. She was transferred from Pakistan to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, England, where she received specialized treatment from a team of neurosurgeons who worked to address the damage caused by the bullet's path through her skull and neck. She had several surgeries, including one to repair damage to her skull and another related to a cochlear implant, and she remained in the hospital for several months. Her recovery was described by her medical team as remarkable, and the damage, while serious, had by extraordinary fortune missed her brain and the critical blood vessels and nerve structures in her neck that a slightly different trajectory might have destroyed. Malala returned to public life with her convictions not diminished but strengthened by the attack, stating on multiple occasions that the Taliban's attempt to silence her had only made her more determined to speak. She co-wrote a memoir, I Am Malala, published in 2013, that became an international bestseller and brought her story to readers around the world. In 2013 she gave a landmark speech at the United Nations on her 16th birthday, calling for worldwide access to education. In 2014, at the age of 17, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, becoming the youngest person ever to receive the honor. She established the Malala Fund, an organization dedicated to ensuring 12 years of free quality education for every girl in the world, and she has continued her advocacy work with extraordinary energy and effectiveness from her base in Birmingham. The men responsible for the attack have faced varying degrees of legal accountability in Pakistan, with some prosecuted and others remaining at large, reflecting the ongoing complexity and danger of the environment in which Malala's story unfolded. Number 10. Roy Sullivan, struck by lightning 7 times and lived. The story of Roy Cleveland Sullivan occupies a unique place in the history of human survival, a story so improbable that it has become the defining example of what it means to survive against astronomical odds, not once but repeatedly, across a lifetime marked by encounters with a force of nature that kills thousands of people every year. Roy Sullivan was a United States park ranger who worked for many years in Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, and over the course of his career he was struck by lightning a total of 7 times, a statistic so extraordinary that it earned him a place in the Guinness World Records and the nickname the human lightning rod. His first documented lightning strike occurred in 1942, when lightning struck the watchtower where he was sheltering during a storm, set the tower on fire, and left a scar on his leg. His second strike came in 1969, when lightning hit him while he was driving his truck, burning off his eyebrows and knocking him unconscious momentarily. In 1970, lightning struck him for the 3rd time as he was walking in his yard, leaving his shoulders scorched. In 1972 he was hit for a 4th time while working in a ranger station, and the bolt set his hair on fire. His 5th strike came in 1973, again setting his hair ablaze and knocking him out of his shoes. In 1974, while he was camping, lightning hit a tree nearby and then struck him through the grass, injuring his ankle. His 7th and final documented lightning strike occurred in 1977, when he was struck while fishing, and the bolt burned his chest and stomach. Each time Sullivan survived, recovering from his injuries and returning to his life and his work in the park. Meteorologists and physicists have offered various explanations for why a single individual might be struck by lightning multiple times, including factors such as spending a great deal of time outdoors in areas with high lightning activity, behavioral factors, and possibly physical characteristics that may have influenced his conductivity, though no definitive explanation has ever been established. Sullivan himself reportedly developed a deep dread of thunderstorms as his strikes accumulated, and he described carrying buckets of water with him as a precaution against the fires his strikes reliably ignited in his hair and clothing. His colleagues in the park reportedly took to avoiding him during storms, fearing proximity to what seemed to be an irresistible target. Roy Sullivan survived all 7 of his documented lightning strikes and died in 1983 at the age of 71 from causes unrelated to lightning, a fact that in itself seems almost anticlimactic given the extraordinary series of electrical assaults his body had withstood over the decades. His case remains the most documented example in recorded history of a single individual surviving multiple lightning strikes, and it continues to be cited in discussions of probability, survival, and the sometimes incomprehensible randomness of fate. His park ranger hat, which bore the burn marks from one of his strikes, was donated to the Guinness World Records Museum, and his story continues to captivate anyone who encounters it as a reminder that sometimes the most unbelievable survival stories are the ones that actually happened.